Okay, welcome everyone. I'm so glad to see each of you again. Welcome back. So this month we're going to be talking about some specific guidelines for shifting from gatekeeping to stewardship within the tenure review process. So I am the same person I was last month, Megan Pollock, and well, that's Casey, but I'm Megan, and I'm excited to be back with you again. My colleague Casey, she's also joining us today. She's in New Orleans,
Mhm.
and she's going to be helping kind of back up for us today. So I think that Tyler sent you the resources for the workshop, but you can download the handouts today, or you can bookmark this file for future reference. Um, at the today's date, so 70v.co/2023-0317. Um, okay, so Casey, thanks for being so helpful. That link for the case study, that's actually an old link.
Oh,
But yeah, so everybody just grab the 70v.co/2023-0317. And then we'll be able to work from there. Hopefully you also have the resources from last time. So last time we talked about on the 210 workshop some specific practices for reducing influence of bias on the tenure review process. There were three specific tools that you all left with: one on cognitive biases, one on the unbiasing method, and then the session pledge. And the session pledge is in your handout also today. So if you want to download the previous tool for 210, it's 70v.co/0210. And so hopefully you'll be able to check that out. Now, I think we've got a pretty small group today, and I'm seeing lots of familiar faces. And so I think most of you were with us back on 210. And with such a small group, even though I have the Slido polls set up, we can just talk and raise our hands and whatnot. So raise your hand or use the Slido poll, whatever you want. Were you here with us last month? Okay. So Chris wasn't. Eva, were you with us last month? Okay, great. Well, we're glad that you're here. Heather, you were here, right? Yeah, okay, great. Um, and so again, if you weren't here last month, I do encourage you to download the resources. If you were here last month, then you're familiar with the case study. We're going to use the same case study that we used last time, just to kind of help us, save a little bit of time in that reading. But if you haven't read it, you'll have a chance to read it today when we're working. Our agenda today is we're going to kind of get started, warmed up with our welcome and overview. We're going to give you a chance to debrief on some of the things that you learned from last time. And for Chris and Eva, even though you weren't here, it's still going to give you space to think about what brought you here today. And we'll talk about key concepts. Because we have such a small group, we're going to hopefully you'll be really talkative and it'll be interactive. We do have a primary exercise where we're going to apply the concepts that we're learning back and reflect it into the case study. And so we'll sort of end today about 12:30. So our overarching goals for today are to compare and contrast some gatekeeping and stewardship behaviors that happen within the tenure review process. Then we're going to take some of the strategies, the stewarding prompts, and some of the other key concepts that we're going to talk about, and solve that within the context of the case study that we reviewed last time. And then the application portion of today's workshop is to give you an opportunity to customize some of those guidelines for your particular tenure review process, or just thinking about how do you apply these stewarding prompts to your practice in general. Now, some of the assumptions that the assumption that I'm starting with today is that each of you care about creating equitable and inclusive environments where race, gender, and any other intersection of identity doesn't work against the success of someone in the workplace. And so, within the scope of our time, I'm not going to try to convince you that these things matter, but we're going to focus really on how do we increase our awareness and take some critical action to improve our practices. One more reminder before we dive into, we'll go into small groups and give you a chance to kind of catch up. Just a reminder for our session pledge, this resource is in your packet as well. And so if you download the PDF or if you check your email that Tyler sent yesterday, this resource is on page 2. And so you can follow along with all of the different kinds of components, but just a friendly reminder that as we embark on this conversation today, we want to do whatever we can to stay engaged. And that doesn't just mean like from the distractions of our phone. It means that even when we sort of find ourselves in places of discomfort, that we don't remove ourselves from the conversation because of that discomfort. And always a good reminder to make sure that we share the mic, that we are being thoughtful to whose voices are being heard and elevated, and inviting those quiet voices. We want to make sure that we're supporting others. So all of us are in different places in our journey. And so we want to help people navigate that with patience and kindness and respect. And then ultimately, we want to make sure that we stretch and reflect and realize that we're all here to try to learn and grow. And so I'm grateful that you're here. And with that, we're going to put you into some breakout rooms so we can just do maybe pairs, Casey.
Okay.
And so we'll share the screen for you so you'll be able to see it. If you don't know the person that you're talking with, introduce yourself. If you do, you can just dive right into conversation. And so if you attended the session from 210, I want you to think about what's something that you put into practice and what did you notice as a result? Or if you didn't have a chance to put something into practice, what's just something that you've been thinking about related to those 3 tools that we learned last time? If you did not attend the 210 session, welcome. We are so glad that you're here. I want you to talk about with your partner, why did you choose to be here today? And what is it that you hope to get out of the experience? So with that, we're going to give you about 5 minutes to chat with a partner. And it looks like we'll have one group of 3 and that'll be okay. All right. So we'll see you back in about 5-ish minutes.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We are back. Welcome
back. So, any reflections from your introductions that you want to share with the group?
I'll just share real quick. At the very end, at least in our group, Manuel made a really interesting point that I hadn't thought about as much before about like faculty in the tenure process, the new faculty who are hiring themselves, like not just the idea of like their committee putting a lot of pressure on them, but faculty themselves being perfectionists and putting a lot of pressure on themselves coming into the process and like ways to sort of work with that, not just sort of working against challenges in the tenure committee, but preconceptions faculty members themselves are bringing to it. That was really interesting.
Yeah, so I'm trying to understand what you're saying. So people who are becoming faculty have maybe some misconceptions about the institution, and so
maybe not as much misconceptions, but like there tend to be very high achieving folks coming into like they're chosen because they're really fantastic instructors, have a lot sort of they put a lot of pressure on themselves, and so helping to kind of demystify our evaluation process even for them. Manuel, is that accurate to what you're sharing?
Yeah, I mean, when we're trying to approach it from a place of compassion and empathy, it's really about also understanding where they're coming from, right? And I think in the conversation that I had with the faculty member that I'm observing, that was very much the case, right? They were much of the nervousness that they were experiencing, not so much about our structure, but it was coming from their expectations of how perfect they ought to be in this observation.
So something to note there is that there is often a difference between the experiences of people from traditionally marginalized groups and that nervousness, and because there has been a very deeply conditioned understanding that you have to work twice as hard to get half as much kind of thing. And that's really part of our conversation today, is recognizing that sort of social capital, recognizing the ways in which systems of oppression have influenced the ways that people sort of move through the world. Another thing that we can recognize, it's a little outside the scope of what we plan to talk about today, but perfectionism is a function of white supremacy. And it really links back to like black or white thinking of like, I'm either going to be perfect or I'm not. And this is water that we all swim in, that, air that we all are breathing, and that all of us have a responsibility to really challenge the ways in which we show up. And are we sort of reinforcing perfectionist ideas? And there certainly is a tendency with overachievers. Listen, y'all, I've been to years of therapy to overcome my own perfectionism, so like you can do it. And it isn't our job to be therapists to everyone, but we can help others to recognize, like, what are those expectations, and how do we really communicate those so that people see what it is that they need to do, and not all of the missing knowledge, social capital. And again, we will talk about sort of the ruling relations of the sort of unwritten rules that kind of fit around that. So it's a great setup for the conversation today. Anything else that came up?
Heather and I talked about, just the bias, just the assumption of students and other people that, just because you're the instructor, that you are the one awarding somebody a grade, as opposed to your role of looking at the student earning their own grade, and the assumption that you have the power as a supervisor as well to kind of, not really penalize people, but sort of in a way, kind of, yeah, and me trying to explain to students, like, I'm here to support you. You are paying me tuition money to teach you the content that you are learning here. So I'm really your servant, rather than I'm the one who is here to catch you and give you an F and fail you and stand in your way. That's not the role, but that's the assumption.
Yeah, and that's also deeply tied to like how people have been conditioned to move through the world with relation to power structures. Because even if that's your mentality, we've been conditioned to understand that education, that employment, that has these hierarchies and power structures. And so to be an inclusive leader means that we reduce those power structures. But people are so deeply conditioned to like having that sort of deference for that authority, and the sort of fear that kind of comes with that. You're challenging the way that they think as well. Good. Thanks. All right, so let's dive into today's topic. A couple of reminders before we dive into the new content. We always want to remember that people aren't broken. We're not here to try to fix people, and we really want to focus our energy and our ideas and our strategy on how do we change the systems. What are the barriers that people are facing? How do we remove them? And then what are the specific supports that we can add that really level the playing field for people? And so as a reminder from kind of what we talked about last month, that instead of trying to change the way people think, we're trying to change the environment in which people make decisions. And so, we're trying to be sort of choice architects. We're trying to figure out, how do we create environments that are framed with tools and strategies and resources that alter the way that we make decisions, because we can't always change the way people think, right? Because our brains are still deeply wired with all of our own lived experiences and limitations and biases. And then the last reminder is that, focus on what you can control and where you can influence in this work. And that's really where we're going to make the most progress. So we're going to dive into, all of you are probably very familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but why I'm bringing this up today is because we're going to be really talking about belonging quite a bit in our conversation today. And so belonging and being valued, these are fundamental human needs. People need to perceive that they are a valued member of a team and experience treatment that satisfies their needs for belongingness and uniqueness in the workplace. And so when we look at where belonging fits into the hierarchy of needs, it's right in the middle, right? It's before we make any decisions about how we feel about ourselves. It's before we can get anything done. We have to experience belonging in a space. However, faculty from traditionally marginalized and minoritized populations are significantly less likely to experience treatment that meets these specific needs in the workplace unless we are particularly intentional about creating those supports and removing those barriers that they're facing. And so another way to think about belonging is to recognize that there is the sort of most common sort of way that we think about belonging is what I call forced belonging. It's this notion of like those high achieving people who are saying, I'm going to belong no matter what. Gosh darn it, I'm going to fit in. And then you sort of become this sort of triangle trying to fit into a round hole. And then the process of like jamming yourself in because you're going to make it work no matter what, you end up losing a part of yourself. You're shaving off your edges, right? And this is all about adapting, adjusting, and really assimilating into cultures. And this is where we put the onus on individuals. We say, hey, you need to belong, try to fit in, or it's when we say, hey, you're welcome here, but don't expect us to change anything. Don't expect us to change the way we operate. And that's very different than structural belonging. So structural belonging is different because we create environments where people get to show up as their authentic selves. We see individuals for the assets, the strengths that they bring. And then this is the environment that we want to strive to create. And so today we're talking about gatekeeping versus stewardship. And so we're going to talk about the definitions. We'll give you some examples of how these might look in an academic setting. We're going to give you a chance to brainstorm these. And then we're going to follow it with four themes to guide you in reflecting in your individual and collective behaviors around stewardship and stewarding. So first of all, gatekeeping, it creates a very hostile and exclusive environment, right? I think all of us have probably experienced gatekeeping at some time, and it is controlling. It is usually limiting general access to something. It's the use of minimizing language, discrediting suggestions, or exclusionary actions that prevent others from achieving something or even feeling a sense of belonging. And so this hostile and exclusive work environment, it influences performance, collaboration, turnover, and the gatekeeping nature of academia and the tenure review process really exacerbate gatekeeping kinds of behaviors if we're not particularly careful. So examples of gatekeeping could be any kinds of hazing behaviors, academic elitism, which in my experience, the institution is often very ripe with, any kind of bias and discriminatory actions, or the sort of notion of like someone not being productive enough, right? Like these are sort of gatekeeping kinds of language. So what this might look like is, and these examples are from, Casey, if you can drop that link in the chat.
Yeah.
So like examples of like a lack of transparency or elitism here. So the first example here is that a candidate's articles are considered questionable because they are not published in one of three acceptable mainstream journals in the discipline, even though the department knew when they hired them that their work was interdisciplinary and that they were hired because of the interdisciplinary nature of their research. So they were hired for these things, but yet judged as not being academic enough because it doesn't fit the sort of mold of those mainstream journals. The second bullet here suggests a candidate's book is discredited as a book because it isn't really long enough to be a real, quote, academic monograph, even though it was published by an academic press whose editors considered it long enough to be an academic monograph. So I want you to think about here for a second, what are some additional examples of gatekeeping in the tenure review process? So you can use the Slido if you want, or just unmute and share. So what are some additional examples of gatekeeping in the tenure review process?
One of the ones that I've seen happen more than once at ECC is trying to enforce a dress code that does not exist.
And who is the dress code being forced upon?
It's almost always women. The notion that you should wear makeup, you should smile more, you should dress more professional.
Yeah. Definitely gatekeeping. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Hopefully that's not what you experienced, but we know dress and, like, I'm going to use quotes, professionalism. Professionalism is steeped in patriarchy and lots of other isms, forms of oppression, right? Of what we deem to be professional, and we can enforce those, whether they're written rules or not, of expectations. What else? What are some other gatekeeping examples? If you haven't done the tenure review process, that's fine yet. Think of just other gatekeeping examples within the institution. Angelica?
I don't know if it's a good example of that, but I've heard it many, many times with higher. Am I breaking up a little bit? Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Breaking
better
up just
now.
a little bit, but yeah, you're better now.
Okay. I've heard it multiple times with hiring adjunct faculty, and then also during tenure process. Is that person a good fit for our culture, for our, for who we are? Are they going to fit well with us?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So anytime we're using language of like good fit for our culture, that can absolutely be gatekeeping. It could be well-intentioned, right? But it can absolutely be gatekeeping. It goes back to, was it George W. Bush, who popularized who's the guy that you want to have a beer with after work kind of saying, of like, who's the person that's going to be a good fit for our team culture and not change anything, right? Anything else that you're thinking of?
I put in the chat language. Specifically, I'm referring to if someone has a foreign accent of some kind, and they are evaluated least or lesser because of it. There's this inclination that we should all speak the same quote unquote formal English. And I think that's a way to gatekeep.
Yeah, it sure is.
One that I've seen that just comes up this past week too is like assumptions about sort of traditional forms of teaching and assessment being more rigorous. So when people do like a different type of assignment or a different way of approaching something, other colleagues in a different discipline or from within their discipline sort of viewing as, oh, that's coddling your students. So sort of that misassumption of like alternatives become coddling, and now we have to make things impossible for students based off of rigor.
Yeah, I've found like just the word rigor in and of itself is like typically like deeply loaded in gatekeeping. And so some of that gatekeeping comes from fear, right? Fear of you're going to change our environment, you're going to change our culture. The language that can really relate to like fears around xenophobia of, who belongs here. The sort of feeling of rigor. I had somebody tell me once of like, I've not earned a PhD until I had to like type with a typewriter and like retype over and over and over again my dissertation. And, you know, like that's because like you don't know how hard it is. Like that sort of notion of rigor. Like these are the sort of good fit kind of language. You know, these are all rooted in places of fear, right? You're going to change something for us. You're going to make my life different or more uncomfortable in some way. Manuel, what were you going to add?
I'm not sure if it falls under gatekeeping, but I wonder if the assumptions we make, and I was thinking more from a student perspective. I haven't quite translated to faculty that are going through the tenure, but you know, as professors, when we make these assumptions about students having quote unquote college going skills already, I wonder if that falls into a gatekeeping role. And I guess as I'm sort of thinking and talking at the same time, I didn't have, let's say I'm a new professor and this is the first time that I'm participating in a tenure process. I'm just learning what tenure means. And if the folks that are evaluating me have the assumption that I know this tenure process completely and I should know how to behave and navigate this process, I wonder if that's is kind of what you mentioned, the social capital piece.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more when we get into the definitions of that later, but it's what you know, what we assume people know, and what they've had access to. And what they've had access to is a function of their lived experiences, a function of their environment, a function of the systems of advantage and disadvantage that they've experienced. So let's keep, if you've got more ideas, jot those down, we can come back to them, but I want to push us forward to talk now about stewardship. So stewardship is being entrusted to what's in your care. It's being intentional about creating an environment where people can grow and improve while enhancing their sense of well-being. And so, and ultimately, it's creating this very enriching and inclusive environment. So let's look at some stewarding examples. So when someone expresses a challenge or loss, instead of explaining why these are dues all people pay or how they're doing things wrong, choose to be compassionate, right? So respect their journey and normalize the struggle. We were all once there ourselves. Or when someone expresses a win or an achievement, instead of reducing that experience or shadowing that achievement behind your own, choose to give praise. Share that these achievements and victories will stack themselves into even greater ones. Help them keep the rocket fuel burning. And again, these examples are from a resource that Casey's going to drop into the chat. So let's look now at how do we sort of see stewarding happening in the tenure review process or within the academy. So what are some examples of stewarding that you see in the tenure review process? So Manuel, you already said something like talking about the sort of what people know or don't know. So stewarding might be extra mentoring for people who are like new to academia, right? Like if they're coming from industry, they have no idea about the sort of institution itself, so you give extra mentoring for that. What's another example?
I am currently sitting in a tenure process of a person, and he just didn't really understand the structure of our curriculum and the way that he was teaching. The very last semester, we have 6 semesters in our program, students, was as if they have heard this content for the very first time. So he was basically just teaching it as if, you know, they've never heard about this stuff before. And those are students who are, you know, ready to graduate. They've had those experiences many times. The program works, and maybe sharing with this new professor so that he can adjust his teaching a little bit better. Not necessarily that he was doing anything wrong, but that he just didn't really understand that this content was not brand new to the students. So they could have contributed a little bit more as opposed to just being taught this content.
Thanks. So I see the link doesn't work, so I'll have to. It looks like it used to work, but we'll figure out why, and get those resources to you. Thanks for that example, Angelica. What else?
I typed something in the poll for some reason. I don't know why we're in a small group, but basically just one thing that Dean Garcia encouraged me to do, and something I'm doing with the candidate I'm working with for tenure, is just providing additional opportunities to meet and answer questions. So just doing additional check-ins with the person, making sure you're always available to them. I just met with my candidate again yesterday, and we've gone over the observation, the recording, and all that sort of stuff a few times already, but it's coming up next week. So we made sure to meet again one more time just to talk through it again, make sure candidate understood exactly what was going to happen with that, and just kind of reinforce that this is all, again, to help support you through this process. We're really wanting this to be a successful experience for all of us. So we're really just here to encourage you and support you, and answer any questions you might have as much as possible, as often as needed.
Yeah, thanks so much, Justin. Yeah, so you're providing access and availability and time to help people ask the questions that they need to get the support that they need. So that's a great example of stewarding. Anything else that you're thinking of?
One of the things that, so in our tenure process, we have the assessment portfolio that gets handed in once a year. And one person on the committee reviews that and provides feedback. And when I was going through the tenure process, I didn't get to talk to anybody on my tenure committee. It was just, I turned over my portfolio, then I got the report and I signed off on it, and that was it. And so now when I serve on tenure committees, what I do is when it's my turn to review the portfolio, we get together off campus and I say, okay, show me what you want to brag about. What are you really proud of? And then it's like, okay, show me what you think that you might need some help with or that you're struggling with. And so instead, it's a conversation. It provides an opportunity to both brag about the good things, hopefully creates a safe space for them to then ask for help on the things that they're struggling with. And we can use it as an opportunity to learn from each other, collaborate rather than simply critique.
Yeah, I like that, Chris. And, I like that you took your experience of like tenure in like a black box and not understanding anything about what was going on in those rooms, and really using inclusive leadership practices of transparency and authenticity and presence and availability. Thanks for sharing that. All right, so let's talk about this. I should give Manuel some credit here, because last year when we talked about this, I had some prompts for you all to consider, but Manuel's always really good about encouraging me to like shape things up and make better tools. And so this is a new tool that came out after I taught the workshop for you all last year. And so, and pulling from the literature, I was able to break down how do we practice stewardship instead of gatekeeping into 4 different functions, and we'll go through each one. But the first is relation, the second is communication, third is location, and the fourth is situation. And this is in your packet on page 5, so you can follow along with this if you want to make notes there. So these are some prompts that you can use to figure out the ways in which you are practicing stewardship. So when it comes to relation, like that's your relationship, right? How are you building community with someone? Are we choosing compassion and empathy? Are we building trust and maintaining integrity? Are we prioritizing others over our egos? So that last one is one that really stands out to me of like, are we, when anytime we say something like the example I gave about the person who said, well, you've never earned a PhD unless you had to type that, right? Like that's loaded in ego, right? Of like, if we're prioritizing others over our egos, most often we're not going to say things like that, right? Next is communication. Are we communicating high expectations and our belief that high expectations can be met? This is actually based on Carl Jaeger's work around wise feedback. Sorry, it left my brain for a second. So it's wise feedback has two components. You're giving a level of high expectation, so you're expressing high expectations, and a convocation of belief that they can meet those. And so if you use those two components, now most of his work was actually focused on students, but this is really good for just all humans of like, if we're expressing high expectations and inserting within the same few breaths that we believe others can meet those, that's really communicating our trust of them. And in his work, they found that that actually builds trust, particularly from people from marginalized populations. And then the second here is, are we encouraging and listening to diverse perspectives in this space? And so this will really connect to some of the concepts that we'll talk about after the break. But in order for us to encourage and listen to diverse perspectives, we have to have some of our own understanding of different perspectives. And so we'll talk about ruling relations and contrasting values as well. And so key message here is like, are we listening, right? Are we listening to the voices of people in these different spaces? The next couple of prompts are around location. Are we making space for other ways of knowing and doing? So again, we're going to talk more about this in the second hour. And then are we stepping out of the limelight to elevate the contributions of others? This question kind of came up in the Intentionally Engineer Inclusion program that we're running right now. And the question that somebody asked was like, you know, when we're learning to sort of recognize privilege and we want to create, you know, the question was, how do we dismantle our own privilege and what do we do with that? And my response to them is like, you know, we can't always dismantle our own privilege, because that's the sort of function of privilege, is like we benefit from systems. But what we can do is make intentional choices to change our position. Sometimes that literally means our physical space, to get out of the limelight and elevate others. I was telling Casey right before we started, because she's about to go on a long road trip, and I recommended to listen to Brandi Carlile. She's a musician, her memoir. I just finished it a couple of days ago. And in one of the very last chapters, she gives an example of, she was asked to like sing at a rally for mostly Muslim people who were, you know, rallying against the Trump ban, you know. And if you don't know who Brandi Carlile is, she is a white woman. She's a white queer woman. And so she found herself like a white queer woman on the stage in front of like mostly, you know, Muslim people, many, you know, brown people with hijabs and whatnot. And it's a really beautiful example. And I made a little video snippet of it. I'll figure out how to get it to you all. So you don't have to listen to the whole book if you don't want to, but I do recommend it. But she talks about how she was invited there to sing, but instead of singing, she and her crew actually fixed the PA system, because the PA system was broken and she had experts there. And it's her reflection of like how she literally was like stepping out of the limelight to elevate and amplify the voices of the people who really mattered there, and to hear their stories. And so this is really what location is. How are we making intentional choices to amplify, to elevate, to get out of the way of people whose voices need to be heard, to get out of the way for people who need to have a spotlight on them. And this is really tapping back into that privilege and ego. And sometimes it takes a lot for us to let go of some of those things and to give up our power and our position for others. And then the fourth is situation. Let me make a note to give you the Brandi Carlile reference. Okay, so the fourth is situation. Are we intentionally engineering an environment that's conducive to growth and well-being? And are we perpetuating or upholding oppressive behaviors that limit access for traditionally marginalized and minoritized groups? And so for thinking about this sort of situation here, it requires a couple of skill sets. One is we have to understand what are some of the oppressive behaviors and what ways are we complicit in upholding them. Using terms of rigor and professionalism. These are oppressive systems that we could be complicit in upholding. And we have to reflect and be self-aware of those things. I recall years ago when I was a young manager, and I had come from industry, so like my view of professionalism was pretty strict. Especially as a woman in engineering, like what I felt that I had to do as a young woman in engineering, how I had to dress was like I had to level up everything, right, to be able to kind of get half as much, right? And so when I was a young manager managing a bunch of consultants around the country, I decided one day I was going to implement a rule that everyone had to wear tailored suits. Justin, I saw your eyebrows. Because that's what I wore. And I was like, somebody showed up to teach one day and like hadn't even ironed their shirt. And I was like, what is this? This is embarrassing. They were like embarrassing the organization. And so fortunately, I sought counsel with some friends before I implemented this policy. And they really challenged me to think about, why did I wear suits, right? And what did that mean for me? And so long story short, I stopped wearing suits and I was liberated from the same sort of oppressive mentality of like professionalism. And it was a benefit to me to like accept other ways of knowing and doing. And so, we could be complicit in upholding these sort of ideas. And so in a little bit, we'll talk about some of the collectivist versus individualistic ways of knowing and doing, and we'll see how some of those contrast as well. But in many ways, if we're upholding the sort of dominant ways of knowing and doing, like those that have been so normalized by the individualist culture here in the United States, we may not even recognize those things. So we have to build our own awareness of those things and constantly learning. And so we've got a couple of minutes before we go to break. And when we come back, we're going to be diving into some key terms. So I want to make sure that you see these key terms here in your packet. They're on page 4. So we're going to be working through these 4 definitions here. And then we're not going to go super deep into contrasting values because I think many of you, from what I understand, teach some of these concepts, so we don't need to go so deep in them. But I just want to make sure that you have this resource because it's going to be useful for when we come back and do the case study. So if you want to have this printed, take a few minutes to print. But any questions on the stewarding prompts before we go into break?
Just something that came up for me related to what you were saying, Megan, about professionalism. I was thinking about our definition or our understanding of what sort of leadership and success really looks like. Right? If I'm thinking about corporate culture, as you were sort of referencing, right, there's this idea to be a good leader or to be a successful leader, you have to sort of follow tradition, even though it doesn't make sense, right? But you have to be rigorous, very firm. You have to have a high challenge, right? And low support. People should be able to figure out ways to do things better for themselves, right? And that's accepted in many different corporate environments. The closest I've seen it here at the college environment really comes from the healthcare professions. So Angelica, I'm kind of throwing you under the bus, but I hear from our nursing colleagues more than anything that this is what their argument is. We are sort of tied by, or we have to prepare our students for the rigors of the work, or what they're really saying is we care more about accreditation expectations than you as a person, right? Is what I hear constantly. And this is highly related. And I don't know how, I mean, I do know how, but is highly related to implicit biases because they don't even see it as such, right? They see it as I'm doing good for the student.
And I understand that, and I think that there's already we should be doing a little bit more of a balance, and consequences of our work. So for example, if you don't show up for your shift and you don't relieve another person, or there's the consequences is potentially human life, and I think that's why we have a little bit higher standards in healthcare, where the responsibilities and our professionalism can really have a huge impact. And I agree that there are certain things that don't have to be as strict and as rigorous, and others really, really do. We do have to have a little bit of a higher standards because it's the responsibility of another person's limb or life is kind of upon us. So the punctuality, the dependability, so it's not only the accreditation. I think the accreditation is yet another step for us, sort of reaching this, I don't want to say perfection, but reaching high standards. But it's really the opposite. I feel kind of it's like sacrificing ourselves for the good of our patients, really.
And just to jump in, because it connects a lot to a conversation I was having with faculty last week in health professions, Manuel, like to this exact point. And I think like what Megan shared earlier about sort of the wise feedback model of like high expectations, but communicating a lot of compassion and trust to meet those expectations. As I remember a conversation with faculty last week about some pretty high expectations about sort of student participation and attendance. And I was trying to wrap my mind around sort of what that looks like from a standpoint of kind of compassion. They were based in, well, here's the expectations in sort of the work environment for this. And what you said that made me feel better is that like when students, if there's any sort of slippage there, having very much a conversation of, okay, what are the sort of the barriers keeping you from participating in this class? Like what are the barriers keeping you from making it to class on time? So that there's a way to still have those expectations, but not be sort of a strict, oh, you're not going to make it in this profession, but hey, let's think collaboratively about how to get you up to that level. And so I do wonder if there's a middle ground to that. Because I agree with you of like, oh, this is just, it's tough in the real world, it's tough in the workplace, therefore it's going to be here. Like that done without sort of the compassion and working with the students to get there seems like that's a big problem. But like there's like some middle ground of like working with that. And I tie it somehow to that wise feedback model of the high expectations and hey, you can get there, but it's going to be a collaborative thing to get you to that point, maybe.
You can respond. Y'all don't have to raise your hands.
It's funny that you say that right now, Tyler, because this is exactly I have an issue with a student right now that is doing exactly that in a way that she is not coming to class, she's not coming to clinical. The bad thing about it is that there isn't really anything in the syllabus that would allow us to kind of take off points or for whatever reason, not for whatever reason, but she's at the point where she's not breaking the rules where we can put her on probation or do anything to kind of let her know. But other students are definitely noticing it. And we had a student who called her out in a group chat saying, this is unfair to us, this is unfair to the professors, that you're not coming to class. I did not like the fact that he spoke on behalf of everybody. He did not know that I was meeting with that student. But the fact of it is that, this kind of behavior is really taking away from, I have to meet with her, which is fine. And I've done all of this work, just like you said, explaining to her and asking for the reasons behind why. There is a certain point where you're just like, how is she going to go when she's hired? When somebody employs her, and this behavior, calling in sick and not showing up for shifts. And so there is both sides to it, really, I think.
So I want to kind of recognize that sometimes when people face challenges, we don't always know what's going on and we can't always fix them. There could be lots of things going on. It could be that nursing isn't a good, if you need to be, I don't know that like I am not like an on time all the time person because it doesn't matter to me. So maybe like working in manufacturing or nursing wouldn't be a good thing for me, right? And so sometimes we have to make those kinds of decisions. So actually, I don't talk a lot about this. I have narcolepsy, and so that deeply affects my career, right? So like when I worked in industry as a young engineer, I would have I had to be there at 8, and we'd stay till the boss left at 6:30, and then we had to be on the phone with, Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines at night, and I wasn't getting my body just doesn't function on that kind of schedule. And so I would fall asleep in lots of meetings. I would fall asleep in like one-on-ones. And so all they saw was a young woman that was probably, and they made assumptions that I was out drinking all the time, right? And so I had to make decisions as I advanced in my career of like, that setting doesn't work for me, my body doesn't function in that kind of way. And so we don't always know what's going on with someone, and sometimes we do have to change the kinds of careers and things that we pick based on our bodies. So I want to honor our 10-minute break. So we'll take a 10-minute break. We're going to come back, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some concepts and then apply this back to our case study. All right. Well, so we'll see you back in 10. Welcome back. So I placed in the chat a couple of resources. So one, the corrected link for the what is the opposite of gatekeeping source. That it looks like he redid his website. So it's the link's there. And I also put up a 4-minute excerpt from Brandy Carlisle's book that I mentioned, if you want to download that and listen to it another time, to get the full example that I was sharing with you. So now we're going to be talking about 4 key concepts that we're going to not dive really deep into, but I want to just introduce them to you as other ways of thinking about how gatekeeping behaviors can show up and what we can do about them, and as we will talk about in our case study analysis. So the first is ruling relations. And I first learned about this concept from, Casey, if you'll drop the citation in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
One of my PhD advisors published a paper called Learning from Small Numbers, Studying Ruling Relations. And it was the first time I had really kind of learned about this concept. And then the citation for the ruling relations in general is there on the screen. But ruling relations, they are the internally coordinated, complex of administrative, managerial, professional, and discursive organization that regulates, governs, organizes, and otherwise controls our societies. He writes, it is not yet monolithic, but it is pervasive and pervasively interconnected. So the thing about ruling relations is that people both experience and reproduce ruling relations. And then those ruling relations coordinate the organization of academic institutions and disciplines to value certain forms of knowledge and knowing, certain ways of investigating the world, and certain modes of collecting and analyzing data. And so despite not having bodies or agency, relations are codified within our policies and our procedures, and they do work. So these relations that are codified, they do work on behalf of the institution and can then act in the interest of the institution over the potential actors over time. So somebody said earlier, like, we're upholding these sort of rules and not focused on the people, right? Those are ruling relations. And so what makes relations ruling is that they primarily serve the interest of the institution over the people who participate in it. And so all of these ruling relations, they are this, it is by definition institutionalized in many forms of oppression, right? It's the institutionalized ways and norms of which things operate. And so keep this in mind. Now we're going to talk a little bit about oppression. I can't go super deep into helping us understand all oppression in this next few minutes, but it is important for us to recognize the ways in which oppression show up. And so oppression and the systems of oppression, just like there are systems of advantage. So systems of advantage are privilege, and systems of disadvantage are those of oppression. And so this specific graph shows how systems of oppression work together, how they interact, and how they overlapped. And so oppression, this is the combination of prejudice and goodness, my tongue is tied today. It's the combination of prejudice, goodness. It is the combination of prejudice and power that then creates a system that discriminates against some groups and benefits other groups. So examples of these systems are all the isms: sexism, racism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, ageism, anti-Semitism, all the isms. And there are some systems that don't have ism words. So these systems, they are designed by people and they are upheld by people, right? So similar to the ruling relations, those are upheld by people. These systems are as well. If you want to learn more about I like this 4I model, the ideological, interpersonal, institutional, and internalized. And this is also in your packet. So if you go to page 9, it gives you the definitions of these 4Is. I just saw a citation yesterday that uses the term interlocking, citing back to some Black feminist authors back in a 1977 publication. So that's a good read if you want to kind of dig that up as well. But that's mentioned here on this document. The Combahee River Collective Statement in 1977. So check this out if you want to learn a little bit more about this. But goodness. So this lens of barriers, we can start to parse out some of the root causes for issues that marginalized and traditionally minoritized people are facing, right? So what are those barriers that they're facing and how do we remove those barriers and again, add those supports? Because again, my lived experience is going to be different than Tyler's experience. It's going to be different than Manuel's experience. We're going to have different lived experiences based on our own identities and the ways in which we experience and function within these systems. So the next key term is social capital that we've talked a little bit about. So Casey, you can drop those citations in the link in the chat as well. And so when we think about capital, we typically think immediately about money. But like entrepreneurs seek venture capitalists to provide money to get their products or whatever created. And so this sort of valued resource in this example, that's purely financial or economic, and it's just one dimension of what capital really means. So for example, some economic capital provides a position of class and individual wealth. Political capital provides a position of authority and individual power, and social capital provides a position of status or prestige and individual reputation. And so the elements of social capital or the embedded resources in social networks include the flow of information. So like, what is it that you know or have heard or don't know? Social ties that exert influence or certifications of an individual's social credentials, and then reinforcements of support and acknowledgement. And so social capital isn't always like these big things. It could be really little things. I remember the first time I really realized like social capital, this is a silly example that you're gonna think is ridiculous. But I grew up with a mother who's not particularly like hyper feminine. And so like she never wore heels or anything. But as a young professional, I wore heels to work all the time. But one day this woman stopped me and she's like, look, honey, you can get your heels fixed. You just go get them retipped at the place over there. And I was like, what do you mean I can get my shoes retipped? So for those of you who don't wear heels, all of your high heels have a little like tip on them and the tips come off after time. But I had no idea like that I could get them fixed because I didn't have a mother or a family that like taught me about getting my shoes recobbled, right? And this lady offered me like this gem of social capital. And I was just like floored of like, well, why have I not been moving in circles that tell me that I can repair my shoes, right? And so it's as little as an example of like knowing that you can get things like this fixed. But all of the sort of nuanced and lived experiences of those sort of secrets of the trade, secrets of like how you sort of move through the world, how do you know who to call? How do you know who to talk to? How do you know how to get the help that you need when you're going up for tenure or when you're going up for a new position or a promotion? It's all of those sort of subtle things that to Angelica might have been like, of course you get your heels reset. Like she might have just been raised knowing that, but I didn't, right? Like that was just not something I knew. And so social capital is this sort of body of an implicit knowledge that sometimes we take for granted that we have, and we have to help understand that some people don't have it and really begin to bridge the gaps for them. So then the next is funds of knowledge. And so again, Casey, you can drop the citation here. But so the funds of knowledge concept was originally applied by Velez, Ibanez, and Greenberg in 92 to describe the historical accumulation of abilities, bodies of knowledge, assets, and cultural ways of interacting that were evident in US Mexican households in Tucson, Arizona. But now when we look at it as a more broad description, we talk about it as it's all of the cultural resources, including the knowledge, the practices, the beliefs and norms and values that are derived from culturally specific lessons within home spaces and local communities of people who have been subordinated by dominant society. And so a lot of times I use language around different ways of knowing and doing. And that's how I really talk about the sort of funds of knowledge or cultural resources. It's like, it's ways of knowing and doing that are different than those sort of dominant ways of knowing and doing that, if your lived experience was like mine, was sort of steeped in the sort of traditional ways of operating in individualism. And then that brings us to the last set of concepts before we go into the exercise here. So contrasting values, when we look at them, looking in versus sort of individualistic versus collectivist cultures. And in your packet, I just finished this resource for another group yesterday. And so it's hot off the presses. So you can look at the contrasting values here in your packet. And so it defines individualism versus collectivism. And this is drawing from multiple resources to kind of help us understand the ways in which we can compare and contrast these. And so for each column, you've got individualism and collectivism, the kind of key concepts, some examples, and then the pink is like how someone might think or say and how that kind of might manifest and show up. And so you can use this if you want to learn more about it, but some of the key differences are individualism has a preference of like self before group, whereas collectivism is a group before self. And the thing about the contrasting values, looking at them from an individualistic versus collectivist culture, is these are like modus operandi. These are the ways in which you have been taught to function. And so for me, I was definitely raised in a very individualistic household. Even though my own personal preference and what I choose to be my values actually align with collectivism, I have to recognize that my first instinct is not a collectivist way of knowing and doing. My first instinct of like what I'm going to do without having some self-regulation and cognitive control is almost always going to be very individualistic. And so as an instructor, as a leader, I have to be really thoughtful and super self-aware of knowing when this is going to show up and how do I bring in collectivist ways of knowing and doing. And what's important to note when we're talking about this is we're not saying one is better than the other. We're saying that if we want to create inclusive environments, we have to acknowledge the differences, bring in multiple ways of knowing and doing, make sure we're not prioritizing and overvaluing one particular set of way of knowing and doing. And so you can look at these a little bit more. Other sort of characteristics are like unique versus connected. Individualistic cultures have a tendency to like really focus on my uniqueness, versus collectivism is around seeing oneself as part of others. Another key one is around competition versus cooperation. Like this sort of notion of like everything's a competition. I put here, like, how do we know who wins? So anybody who says that, you know that they are probably steeped in individualism, right? Also, another example is like taking and saving versus giving and sharing. So this sort of tendency to stockpile resources. Um, I first really learned this about myself when I was a younger facilitator. I would get really, really protective of my markers. Now I would buy these fancy markers and I would like make sure that I had my name on them and that like I didn't want anybody to take them, and I was like really careful that nobody like pushed too hard on them. And like it took a lot of self-work to be like, they're just markers, Megan. It's okay if they walk away. It's okay if they press too hard. But like this was very much like, these are my markers. Don't hurt my markers, right? And maybe this you can understand that, but like that's when I really realized that this was part of my like modus operandi of like, I have this culture. Whereas now I'm just like, oh, you need a marker here, you can have my marker. So again, you can use this as other examples. Structured time versus flexible time. We talked a little bit about nursing and time, right? So, you know, when we look at individualistic cultures, it's very structured. Here's our agenda. I'm gonna outline it in detail. We're starting promptly at this hour, no deviations. Whereas flexible time, which is more collectivist, is much more about like, oh, well, we'll get started once everybody gets here, you know. And again, some institutions don't allow for flexible time, right? But we have to acknowledge that some people, that's not their MO, so they may struggle more for those things. Another one that is particularly stands out to me is work ethic versus work value. I learned this the most. I lived in Spain between my bachelor's and master's. I worked as an au pair, and I lived with a particularly wealthy family, and he was a CEO of a large civil engineering firm. And I noticed the way that his family operated was so different than like every way of living that I knew in the United States. Like even though he was a CEO, he took off every afternoon to go swim laps, and he was home for dinner every single day. And I remember talking with him, and he was like, yes, you know, we have, you know, here, you know, you Americans, he said, you all live to work, and we work to live here, right? Like life is about living, not about working. And it was the first time as a young adult that I really learned like, wow, my entire identity is in my work. And that's very different in collectivist versus individual cultures. And then the last one, which is also important, is recognizing the tendency around egalitarian and hierarchy. So even though within the US culture, we tend to like hierarchy, as in we put lots of hierarchy in place, the dominant culture doesn't like it, right? So that's such a confusing thing to me of like, we create all of these hierarchical systems, but people don't always respect those systems. Whereas collectivist cultures, they have a much greater deference for those hierarchies. And so we can see how this plays out, particularly for people from traditionally marginalized and excluded populations, that for me, as you know, an individualistic person who was raised in an individualist kind of way, like I don't have any issue calling up a CEO and being like, this is a problem, right? Like we need to address this. Whereas someone from a collectivist culture would like never do that, right? So it's that sort of power distance of like how I feel like I can address the issues versus people who are raised in different kinds of ways. So with all of these in mind, and so again, you can study these a little bit more. We got a couple of comments, so let's open the mic. What are y'all thinking about? Chris is pointing to Tyler.
Well, Chris and I were just sharing, it sounds like similar for both of us, the structured versus flexible time is a point of growth. Like that often cuts me to the bone of like, we need to be doing something right now. It's been an hour. We haven't gotten anything I want to talk about. Like in different like meetings I'm leading, and like I'm in meetings with a lot of folks who help to challenge me on that, which is good. But yeah, I was just sharing that one. I can relate a lot to.
So Tyler, I encourage you to read about, and there's a citation here. If you're interested in learning more about the history behind work ethic, there are 2 links here. Because that sort of drive for productivity at all costs is rooted in like the puritanic or Protestant work ethic. And when I first learned about that, it actually gave me a lot of relief. I didn't realize that I was so tied up in this, like, I have to do. Now, listen, I'm an engineer. My whole life is about product order and efficiency. So, like, I like and thrive in that. But it's helped me like reduce my perfectionism a lot by understanding how am I unconsciously subscribing to this sort of puritanic Protestant work ethic of like, we just work hard because that's just what you do. And we have to be productive. And so it's that self-awareness and challenging that. So that might be interesting too, if you haven't read about that. Manuel's nodding. So he's saying, yeah, Tyler, please read that. That's what he's nodding.
I'll take the point. Yeah.
I would
No,
add that a struggle that I see with collectivism, where it's, yes, this is something that we want to move into. I worry about how various people can use that philosophy as a cudgel to badger you or bully you into groupthink and marching along with not changing the status quo kind of thing.
Yeah, and what I'm not advocating for here is that we all become collectivists. What I'm saying is it's like an acknowledgement of understanding your own primary ways of knowing and doing, and ensuring that you're making space for other ways of knowing and doing. So if I'm holding someone, for example, if I have expectations that all my employees are going to adhere to my same hustle culture, I'm enforcing individualistic, ideologies on them. Whereas if I look and say, like, okay, what's the value that they're bringing here? What is it? Are they getting the job done just because they're not in that sort of busy bee culture? It's making space for that. It's acknowledging that, if somebody is having an issue, maybe not speaking up for themselves in a way that I think that they can, it could be a manifestation of their own lived experiences. So how do I make space for them? How do I make sure I'm inviting their voice in? I do think that there is a lot of value for us as we learn to sort of build in collectivist ways. I think as I've learned to build in collectivism, I think it's made me a nicer person, to be quite honest, because I'm just not so like wired and structured. But that's not to say all individualists are mean, but like it has helped me, right? So again, it's not advocating one is better than the other. It's just understanding that like competition is something that I talk a lot about within the engineering education space. If you look at every like engineering pre-college thing, they're all competitions, all of them, right? And this is problematic because it reinforces individualistic ways of knowing and doing. It doesn't honor the sort of cooperative nature of this. And even for like First Robotics, and I've consulted for them in the past, like they try to bring in this cooperation piece, but still somebody's got to win, right? Like it can't ever just be about the learning. It can't ever just be about the experience. Somebody always has to win. And so then we question, why are we continuing to not see people from traditionally marginalized and excluded populations enter into these fields? And it's because we keep saying, well, this is engineering, right? And so it's that question.
Well, I think it goes beyond just engineering. I think it's academia, right? It's embedded in this notion that our grading system is competitive, right? An A is better than a B, and a B is better than a C, and people are competing for that grade. And that's how we're raised in this system of competition. So the comment that I provided in the chat was I grew up in that world of competition. And in fact, I embraced it, right? Maybe not so much of my home life, but my sport life, right? It's highly competitive. And when I'm competing, I'm having fun. And so I translated that to the classroom when I first was starting to teach. And I thought anytime that I'm building competition or quote unquote a game for students to compete, I was engaging them. I was having fun. But it took a long time for me to recognize, like, yeah, fun for some, and especially for those from individualistic cultures, yes. And in fact, I still to this day, now that I don't treat it as a competition, you all know about Kahoot, right? Is one of the platforms that you can use to do review quizzes or such. Kahoot is sort of famous for adding points, right? For every question that you get right, you get a certain amount of points, and how fast you answer it, you get more points. And then at the end, they even have a podium for third place, second place, and first place. And students, some of the students look forward to that. They want to see themselves in this podium. And when I took away the points, some of the students is like, what's the point of doing this if there's not going to be any points? Like, that's not the point. The point is the practice of it. But yeah, it took me a long time for me to be aware that this was more my orientation and not the student's orientation.
Yeah. And thanks for sharing that. And so again, it doesn't mean we cut all competition from the classroom. It just means that we're doing some things that aren't competitions. Angelica, I saw your comment. I missed it for what we were talking about earlier. You mentioned valedictorians.
I was just agreeing with Manuel.
Okay.
I was agreeing with Manuel that A is better, and then we have valedictorians who have the highest GPA. So it's just an example supporting what Manuel was saying.
Yeah.
But I wanted to add, I was explaining to students also about individualist and collectivistic cultures, and I had this one student like literally challenge me, and she's like, well, where's this magical world that you're talking about? And I was like, a lot of the countries in the world actually have that nature. I mean, she was mad at me for even like introducing this idea. And so I thought of a better way of explaining it. And I said, well, your cohort of students, you're together for 6 semesters, you're collectivistic culture because you're helping each other. You're staying after class, you position yourself, you're not competing with one another. You all are going to graduate and get different jobs. And that would be a perfect example of like a mini micro, system. And she just did not trust me. It was rough.
Yeah, so a lot of times we're challenging people's worldviews of like, what do you mean people operate differently than me? Like that can't be true. And that is 100% a function of privilege when we live in a world that we're so surrounded and have not enough awareness that there are other ways of knowing and doing. I like to teach the collectivist and individualistic cultures because it was something for me in my own personal growth and journey in this work it was such an awakening moment of realizing how deeply steeped I was in dominant ways of knowing and doing, and how I wasn't making space or even understanding that there's a whole other world of people who function different than me. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back into breakout rooms. Casey, let's do 2 groups this time. You can mix them up.
Great.
You've got the case study. So let's not copy the notes here, but so you've got in your PDF the case study back up here. So it's the 3 pages. So you're going to read through the case study, and I've got some questions for you here to think about. Where do you notice gatekeeping? Who was doing it and what did it look like? In which ways was stewardship introduced? What did it look like? Who challenged it? What were some of the examples of non-dominant ways of knowing and doing that were evident in the candidate's application or among the conversation between faculty? And then what are some examples of opportunities to build the social capital of the candidate? And so again, you're holding space for the contrasting values, the funds of knowledge, that's different ways of knowing and doing, the ruling relations, and and then understanding the sort of systems of oppression there. And so we're going to give you, we'll start with 10 minutes and then I'll check in on your groups to see how you're doing. And then we'll come back and then debrief it all together.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Manuel, I'd also like to see the content portfolio being two-way as well, where
I
it's
love
not
that. I mean,
just so that the committee members are providing examples of this is what we do, and we found it to be
absolutely.
very effective in these classes. And so you're not just flailing in the wind blindly trying to meet arbitrary check boxes. You're
Yeah.
actually focused on specific feedback and specific examples, kind of thing.
And that does another, I guess it meets another objective of building community and stewardship as well, right? Because
Yeah.
now you're in collaboration with the person. You're not just in a position of critiquing, right? You're in a position to collaborate and give some guidance. And there's much more to be said with that type of support than just here's some check boxes that I have to check off.
It also makes it far more beneficial for the people who are serving on the committee instead of just a time suck. There's an opportunity to actually learn and grow ourselves when we're serving on the tenure committee, as opposed to just focusing on the person in tenure as the only person in the room who needs to grow. It just always seems foolish to me that that's the attitude that so many take.
So, welcome back. Let's keep debriefing. I want to keep hearing some of these ideas that you shared and kind of put into broader context for the people who were in the other group, maybe some of the things that you were sharing. So, what were some of the key reflections and takeaways that came up for you in your conversation?
I can start from our group. One thing, in terms of a question that gave us pause, that was the challenging one for us to answer, but I think we got some good headway with ideas Heather shared, was the question about sort of what kind of social capital could we support the candidate in having. And our initial challenge of the question was like, at least for me, and I think we were talking in the group too, like several of our suggestions were things that kind of would help her to meet the problems of the system to begin with. So things like, hey, the candidate, here's ways to kind of better pitch a TED talk that's going to satisfy the sort of good old boys on your committee that don't value a TED talk in the beginning. And the challenge we had is like, well, it just like in some ways keeping that system propped up in a not helpful way. And it's kind of a specific thing. Heather, you can jump in too, but then you were talking to Heather about sort of just supporting faculty in like self-promotion that wouldn't just be for this tenure committee, but just across the board, ways to kind of positively talk about yourself. Again, not to meet necessarily somebody else's standards, but that is sort of a social capital skill to build up in candidates. That was the way that we started answering that question that I think at first gave us a lot of pause about how to do that well.
So that creates a really good connection to looking also at systems of oppression. And so there are deep ideologies that have conditioned particularly women from not speaking up about their accomplishments, because when they do, we think all kinds of other things about them. And so it's not always just about social capital. It's about helping to reduce the internalized effects of a system that has conditioned us our entire lives to not talk about ourselves and our successes. And so what that often means is that we need to be the advocates, allies, and champions and help speak people's success into spaces. And so this a lot of times goes to men, right? It's not saying women don't need to also learn how to overcome that internalized ideologies, but sometimes there is less risk for our male advocates to speak some of those things, because otherwise, as women in these spaces, we face a double bind, right? Of if I am both competent, I cannot also be likable. I can be likable, but I can't also be competent. And so, how do we understand the systems that we exist in and elevate people in a way that is conscious of those things? What else came up for you?
I think in the same vein, something came up in I mentioned it in our group about social capital, but with a question mark. So it's associated with what you were saying, Megan, because I wonder if it's social capital or if it's acculturation. Because with regards to diverse education, I think I was referencing there's I think it was Nathan that made a comment about diversity education or trying to make a case for diversity education in the science. So I wonder, is this social capital to prepare that person to justify the role of diversity education in the sciences? Right? Are you actually helping that person, or are you just acculturating that person to defend themselves in this more hostile environment? So I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I think that there's two perspectives to this. One, there's an awareness that we all function within systems that for some of us, the systems weren't designed for, right? And so we acknowledge sometimes the onus for those of us who wish to survive and to thrive in those systems. We do have to play a game a little bit, right? So I think as leaders, there's an empathy component to this of like a sort of sorrow for like how we can't change the system in an instant. So we're trying to equip you to be successful within the system, but then there's also the responsibility for what is it that we're doing to change the system. And so it's saying acknowledging that this isn't fair, and here's some survival tactics to do in that, but then what are you doing within your own leadership to begin to adjust those kinds of systems? So I think it's both, because I think it's not prudent to just continue to not offer people who have the awareness of the systems, we'll say the good old boys club, right? Like if you don't have an awareness of that, I remember distinctly one of my mentors years ago. It was actually at her retirement party, and she was from Texas Instruments. And she had mentored me as a young professional for years, and she still mentors me today. But she had just introduced me to this other woman who was probably 15 years my senior. And she had kind of turned away from me to talk directly to this woman and who had just gotten a promotion. And she said, "Remember what I told you, be a man." And I was like, whoa, what? And she turns back, she's like, "Megan, I've coached you differently because I want it to be different for you. But for her right now in this system, this is how she's going to get ahead." And like, it just blew my world, because I was like, this is not what you have told me. Right. And, but yet in further conversation, she was like, and unfortunately the reality is that we're trying to change the environment so that by the time you get to a point in your career, that's not how you do it. But for how it is now, this is the guidance that we give to women leaders in industry. And so there's this sort of honesty of like, we still have a responsibility to prepare people to survive in these environments, and acknowledge that we're still working and hoping and striving for it to be different. Oh, Manuel, you're talking about the character and the I thought you were talking about somebody here said that, and I was like,
oh no.
What else came up for you in your conversations? Oops. So I want to make sure we have some time to reflect. So I still want to take some of your takeaways from your conversation. If you all had a chance to move towards the application, these prompts are on page 14, and then on page 15 are just general reflections from the day. And so what I want you to do before you go, I see your note, Manuel, is that to make sure that you're thinking about how can you use the stewarding prompt in your practice, whether it's serving on tenure committees, whether it's serving as an instructor, as a leader, as a manager, supervisor, whatever. How can you use this kind of tool to systematize, to change the environment in which you are making decisions, right? So remember, we're trying to change the environment in which we make decisions to reduce the ways that all of our the ways that our brain might show up in ways that doesn't reflect our values. And then I want you to think about how will you expand your personal awareness of social capital, funds of knowledge, ruling relations, and contrasting values, and then strive to then institutionalize some of the more diverse ways of knowing and doing within your work. So I want to make sure that you capture those reflections moving forward, and then give us some space to talk about these now. So how might the case study scenario have played out differently if the committee members were aware of and talked about gatekeeping and stewarding behaviors? Or what if they just said, hey, let's read this tool together before we start our meeting and remind ourselves how we want to function and operate? How could it have played out differently?
In our group, we talked about how there's just the lack of the vocabulary maybe needed to express what the problem is that's happening within this conversation. I think about previous experiences I've had at other institutions where this type of thing was going on, and I probably reacted more like how these characters do, which is maybe like, mocking the person for their outdated viewpoint as a way of trying to combat it, as opposed to like actually really trying to get them to check what they're doing and resolve that situation and make sure we're all aware that what they said was wrong. And let's not really think that way and talk that way. Let's focus on the best strategy going forward with how to really assess this person's abilities for this position. But yeah, I've been in that position myself where it's like, yeah, you make fun of that person for not being around as kids. That's a really weird, dark way to respond to something. Everyone laughs at it. Everyone moves on. It didn't contribute anything other than to kind of just take the air out of what he said or him as his ego, but it doesn't fix anything. It doesn't resolve anything. And in fact, it contributes even more negativity into the conversation and makes it more of a antagonistic, combative sort of conversation, as opposed to one where you're really all trying to collaborate together to resolve and come to some consensus.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, not to say like what this character did wasn't humorous. Like if you have a way of like still infusing humor into tough things, like please do that. Like I am not a comic. Casey leads like all these improv groups, so she could probably give us some lessons on like how to infuse humor into tough conversations. But yeah, again, the idea is not to push in negativity and to mock, because mocking pushes people out, right? We're trying to bring people in and create those environments. What else? Manuel, before you go, do you want to add anything else?
No, not specifically. That's coming to mind. I have to take some time to think and ponder.
Okay. I am grateful to you for pushing me last year to make this tool. So hopefully it meets your expectations, Manuel.
No, for sure. This was completely, I didn't notice the big difference, but it definitely was engaging from the beginning to the end.
Good. So perhaps we can give everyone a minute or two to kind of self-reflect. So take a minute or two to self-reflect, and then let's debrief what you come up with. So 1415, page 1415, work through what you can, and then we'll debrief here in just a minute. All right, let's come back together. Let's go round robin and give everybody a chance to report out something that they're taking away from the day, some learning goals, strategies, plans that they want to employ. Who'd like to go first? So let's do this. Whoever goes first, then we're going to popcorn it around. So then you call on the next person. So who's our lucky person to kick off?
All right, I'll go first.
Thanks, Chris.
I think the biggest takeaway I have from this is that I have another reminder that I have personal growth to engage in. My instinct is always to smack down when I see bad behavior. And so reminding myself to step back and temper my reaction when I hear somebody engaging in behavior I disagree with. As far as takeaways, I am looking at, so I did the first part of the training last year in the pilot, and I'm doing the other two parts this semester because we are going to be renegotiating the faculty evaluation handbook. And I'm trying to see what changes we need to institutionalize in that handbook, if at all possible, to make sure that we have consistency across divisions and departments in attitudes and training, and just can we even get an institutional agreement on what is the purpose of the tenure process kind of thing, and then build from there. And I'm going to pick on Ava.
Thank you, Chris. So I haven't been on the first part of training, so for me it was very, very challenging to understand the key terms. So that was very, very challenging, and I tried to read through the notes that Taylor sent previously. So for me it was very eye-opening for many things, especially gatekeeping and stewarding. So I wasn't aware about those terms, and as I grew up in Poland, we had totally different system than it is in the United States, and that's what you, Megan, said, that people in Poland work from 7 to 3, and then they have life. Here, it's like I work from 7 to 7, and then I have another job to do to grade my tests and prepare for my lessons. So this was something new for me. So I think I will be more focused right now to go back to actually having life and less, like try to separate work from life. So that's my goal, and to find back my inner peace. So okay, I work, I'm done, and then after a certain hour it's my time or me time. So I'm gonna pick on Angelica because I know her.
Because I'm Polish too, right?
Probably. And we can connect. So, and I saw you yesterday, so
We're buddies now. Yes. For me, and I've been listening and learning from Megan for a long time now. So a lot of the things that I was doing instinctively I didn't know that they had terms, that they had names, that there is a reason for it. I'm very lucky to have been raised and lived in 2 different cultures, actually 3 different cultures, if you think of healthcare as a different culture. So, I have this unique opportunity to inspire some of my students, I think, and I relate to them on many levels, and to many of them because I had the opportunity to be part of the 2 or 3 different cultures. I feel like I've made a lot of positive changes and I've inspired many students. I've been told this over the years over and over. And I want to continue doing it. Right now, I am in a new position. I'm an interim program director. So again, I was given an opportunity to even impact a bigger change, maybe on a bigger level as far as our clinical affiliates go. And I feel like I really need to take this opportunity. I'm tired. I'm overworked. I'm tired. I don't want to do it. Like every fiber of my body is like, just go get some rest, but then I keep getting re-inspired and re-inspired. So, yeah, I'm hoping that maybe the culture of, push them into the deep water and see if they sink or swim attitude towards our students can be changed a little bit, and maybe be, if I can inspire some of our clinical affiliates to be more supporting of our students without sacrificing the high standards that this healthcare profession has. I think that would be my goal. That would be the action that I would like to take based on this.
All right, you get to call on someone. You can call on Heather, Justin, or Tyler.
Justin.
Thanks, Angelica. So there were a few things that really jumped out at me. I really, really liked the breakdown of individualism and collectivism, and I saw myself typically being skewed one way or the other. I wasn't necessarily all one side, but I was definitely like on the extremes, it seemed like, on both sides. And so just trying to figure out how to get that more balanced to where it's not one or the other. I can kind of bridge kind of the good parts of both of those things and bring those things together and kind of see if I can mitigate some of the more negative aspects of being too much on either side of one of those. I've come from teaching into administration. I'm in my fourth year as administrator, but my first year here at this school. And I'm coming from an institution that the ruling relations overruled everything. That was the way that institution ran, which was one of the reasons why I didn't really like that institution. Once I got into the administrative position, I feel like I'm a humanist. I feel like I'm really valuing people as people and wanting them to be their best and be supported as much as possible. And I do see that here. That's one of the reasons I'm happy to be here. But I have to kind of get rid of a lot of negative conditioning I've had as well over the years of prioritizing a rule over a person, and especially also coming from a faculty life before that, where you have your syllabus and the rules are the rules, and you do make allowances here and there, but there's just, academia is so interesting to me in terms of how rigid it seems to be, but how malleable the people within it can operate, provided they understand the ways to accomplish what they need to accomplish to support people. So I'm going to continue trying to grow and develop in that direction of bridging these kind of elements that are within my past and my present and my future, and just trying to make sure that I continue to be as supportive and listening to other people and considering all voices and bringing everyone together as much as possible. And Heather, do you want to share?
Sure. So I think my takeaway from today was just stewardship, and just kind of making more of a conscious effort to contribute to that growth and supportive environment, rather than just, I know last time we talked a lot about bias and kind of what we see in the workplace, but like taking that next step and contributing to the support to overcome it in a systemic manner. Tyler, your turn.
I'll share just two things quickly. One is, in the framework of moving from gatekeeping to stewardship, kind of similar to what Chris was sharing earlier, like how necessary it is to both sort of call out and sort of challenge while providing an alternative, or while providing at least the question of like, what does the alternative then look like to move to? And so how necessary that sort of step is. And similar to Chris, like with the faculty evaluation processes coming up for discussion, I'm not sure how much I'll be involved with that, but like having the sort of model of, let's actually move, like the language to point to, as Justin was sharing earlier, the benefit of having a language of, oh, this is what we want to look at, stewardship. This is the idea, like how important that will be to frame those discussions. The other thing I'll just mention quickly is the point about sort of internalized oppression or internalized like lack of self-efficacy of the faculty coming in. Like, so Heather and I are in a beneficial place that we get to work a decent amount with all the new full-time faculty. And so a challenge of like, what are things that Heather and I can do to sort of really call attention to that and support faculty with those sorts of skills as they start at ECC? Or the other sort of takeaway point.
Thanks so much, Tyler, and to each of you for sharing your reflections. You know, if you want to learn more about the 4 eyes of oppression and dig deeper into that, I am on a personal mission to help people understand that. And so if you ever want to talk about it, let me know, and I can either share some resources or we can talk about it, because I think that, to me, that as a practitioner in this space, it is the most powerful tool that's helped me begin to have a greater understanding, awareness, and capability to see barriers and begin to remove them. And so I hope that is also helpful to you as well, even though we didn't go super deep into it. But we're at the sort of designated sort of a breaking point. I really value your feedback. You can do that. I put the link in the chat to go to engineerinclusion.com/thanks. And and so again, if you, whatever feedback that you share with me, I'll share with Tyler and Christina, or if you have feedback you want to give directly to them, you're welcome to do that as well. And I just want to thank you for being here, and for bringing all of your lived experiences and expertise to this space, because whatever learning we get to create is a function of you. And so I'm grateful for that. If you have any questions and want to continue the conversation, reach out. Otherwise, I hope to see you back here again next month. And I didn't make a note of the actual date, but it's about 1 month from today. And then we'll continue in this series. I'm a little delinquent in getting the recording from last time together. And so I'll get that recording and then this recording done, and then uploaded, and then share those links with Tyler so that he can share them with everyone. And again, I'm just really grateful for your time, and I hope that we'll see you again soon. Bye, y'all.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Everybody.